Thank you so much, Lillian. Fantastic presentation. And, you wouldn't have been able to see the chat as you presenting, but you're getting a lot of very positive feedback. And it complemented John's presentation so well, particularly, as I was saying before, John's work influenced, how we work at Stats, and certainly the SEEDS model was very well represented in your presentation. Some of you that have not attended clinical masterclasses before, the model that we tend to use is that we have a presentation, but somebody who's usually an expert in a particular subject, and that's complemented by a case study by one of our counselors. On occasion, we've had counselors from other FAST agencies that somehow reflects the content of the presentation, and yours did that extremely well, Lillian. Thank you so much. So we got probably more questions than we've ever got in one of these, and we got a bit over half an hour to answer as many as we can. So I'll go through them. I'll read them aloud in terms of how well voted they are. So I'll start with questions from Amparo Landman, which reads: working with elderly refugees, I noted that it is hard for them to feel motivated to improve their health, even when they understand the importance of it. One of the things I hear a lot is, I am too far gone. The idea that it took them decades of certain behaviors to get to this state, and that they don't have enough time to see a change if they start to implement new behaviors. So what would you say to them in regards to how fast they could see an improvement, or even if they didn't see it, in terms of reversing some of the damage? John, would you like to start first? That came up straight after your lecture, and then Lillian, feel free to comment on it as well, because your case really addresses that issue too.
Sure. And before answering or addressing the question, I want to say that my internet during my talk kept going on blink. So at the end, I was sort of trying to speed up a little bit. So I apologize. And it's consistently going in and out. So I apologize if I go completely blank, because in the hotel that I'm in, people are using the internet apparently. So it's kind of slowing down my feed. So let me respond to the question. Everybody, no matter what their age, I've heard throughout my career in mental health is, well, first of all, motivation, and do I have time, and is my brain broken? Am I so far gone, was the quote that our questioner was asking. And I gotta say that I am so convinced that bringing some of the science down to earth with our clients is so critical. Because if they just think in these very sort of, let's just say they're very pessimistic and old ways of thinking, like not only do I have a broken brain, but my genes are bad. And there's no evidence, in fact, that even Alzheimer's patients that are in their now late 80s can't slow down the progression. I mean, the science is there that no matter where you are, you can do something to both. It's not like you're going to have Alzheimer's and all of a sudden not have Alzheimer's. I'm not saying that at all. But somehow, if we help our clients understand that it's what they do that can slow down whatever they think happened to their brain in terms of the breakdown. And so that all being said, that's easy to say, but do you actually experience it? So they need to feel some rewards initially. Everything's about motivation. And we have this motivational network in our brain. There's this grand central station, if you heard that term, for pleasure. And if you get some sense of pleasure by doing something, you can do that. And so I know that in many counseling formats, people are restricted to their offices in 50 minutes and so on. Frankly, I was too, but I broke the rules constantly, and people went along with me. And that was, I got out of my office. I took walks with people. I did things that were out of the norm, so to speak, just so they could experience some kind of, whether it was sitting in the sun, watching ducks fly, go by on the pond, or whatever. So whatever we can do to prime the pump, by helping them learn that there is some gain to be had that can be built. That's where you build in the motivation, because they could see it instead of, yeah, doc, I've heard that one before. I'm sick of you people. And this multimodal approach that Lillian did a wonderful job explaining, because she just wasn't in one area, but rather she was looking at the target was all over the place. It wasn't just in one particular area. And that's what I think we ought to be doing with our clients, is not necessarily just thinking that do one thing differently, then everything else is going to change. So whatever you could do with them to prime the pump, to make them feel a little bit better. Frankly, I did walks with people. and then later I asked them that, if you don't want to do a walk with me, you got to do a walk before you see me. And I want to smell a little sweat before you actually see me. I've done it before they saw me too. So priming the pump, I think, is really critical here in helping, let's say, kindle the motivational network, I think, is really what we're looking at.
Thank you, John. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those are very, very true, very insightful. And what comes to mind is, the SMART goals, the acronyms, sort of, I say it, but now I can't remember what they're standing for. But like, just, like those setting small and achievable and incremental goals over time. Because I think if we set the bar too high, and that sort of sets up clients to fail, and then that can reinforce, I guess, that those feelings of helplessness and shame or whatever that they're already feeling, when they come to us. So I don't know, sometimes in the therapy room, I'm a bit like a golden retriever, just looking for all the things, that they've done right in their narrative of what's gone wrong. Just being really curious about when things have worked out well for them and why, and sort of normalizing, I guess, trying and failing in the process of it. But yeah, just sort of helping them to realize, to regain that sense of achievement and self-efficacy. Yeah.
Thank you, Lillian. Might take you to the next question, which comes from David Perez and reads, in an era of increasing digital technology use, what are your thoughts on its impact on brain health, and how can we mitigate negative effects?
Shall I go?
Yeah.
Okay. Just in the past week, there have been multiple reports of actual studies on the effect of digital health, but the certain digital effects, meaning social media, being caught on the web and everything else. It's almost like there's benefits. And we've talked about this, in fact, even last night, in terms of, during COVID, what did we all do? We started doing Zooms all over the place. And many people that were isolating did have contact with their family members through Zoom. And that was absolutely critical. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. But the bottom line is, the more this was actually a study beginning in 2001 and thereafter, that showed that the increase in time spent on the net increased depression big time. And that was like, what's that, 23 years ago. And the cumulative body of evidence indicates that the more time you spend away from actual social intercourse, the more depressed and the more cognitively impaired you are. On the other hand, I don't want to, again, say that it's bad, because let's face it, there are some benefits. They're not only in the mental health system, but also I have two sons, and both of them live 700 and 800 miles away. And those kind of contacts are actually really important. Jorge, you talked about your daughter and being in Europe and you here. Very important. But the question is, how much do you do it? And how can we help our clients know that there is some deficits there? You know what? I know I'm constantly quoting studies and everything else, but I invite people to kind of look it up themselves a little bit and know that the more time that they spend away from people, the less time that they're going to actually feel good about anything in terms of even gene expression. And many people think their genes are stuck and their DNA is their destiny. So I'm really curious about gene expression and epigenetic research and digital time online. I think we're going to see something soon.
Thank you. Unless you want to add something to that, I might take you to the next question and maybe start with you on this one from Kirsten Mullet, which reads super interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. It was referring to your presentation, I think here, John. But one of the main issues working with individuals affected with trauma is that they have low self-esteem and often unable to take care of themselves, often have some addiction, smoking and drinking, if not more. Therapy can do a lot to help them heal from trauma, but building up the capacity for self-compassion and self-care is another long road. Any suggestions? Maybe Lynn, if you're gonna go first on this one, because Christine says that a lot of the aspects of this question were answered by your presentation. So,
yeah, thank you, Christine. I think it's absolutely very, very true. I think all of your observations, the low self-esteem, and then with the sort of ability to sort of take care of themselves. I guess the question is how much of that, is because of something like depression, or is the functional decline because of other things like mobility issues and things like that as well. And even like the role transition from working to retirement, and then the loss of like a lot of their previous capacities, I think that all of those things can be really significant triggers for like that low self-esteem, and perhaps almost like a grief-like response to what has been lost. And then like with addiction behaviors and things, that's very true as well. I think I don't know if I have much to add to that, but that I think the self-compassion approach is also, I've also used that a lot, and I think particularly with older clients, it can in some ways be more challenging to sort of foster that sort of compassion for themselves because of all those things I've mentioned, and sometimes the cognitive stuff as well. But I think just like small gradual steps again, and that really motivational approach. Been really enthusiastic about every little small win.
Thank you, John. Anything you'd like to add?
There's a lot of support for this idea that there's a dichotomy that sometimes results in people getting stuck. And it's all related to approach versus avoidance. And avoidance cultivates less self-esteem because it's easier to get caught up in your own negative self-talk and everything. In the CBT world that when I was a young guy, I didn't particularly like them because I was psychodynamic and yoga and all that kind of stuff, but they were right. And that was about avoidance creates anxiety, and withdrawal creates depression. And then later, by the end of the 1980s, there was a lot of neuroscience support for those beliefs. And the belief is avoidance creates dynamics in the brain that makes you more depressed. What's that about? We've got two hemispheres, and the more activity on your right, the more likely to be depressed and anxious. I know everybody thinks the right hemisphere is the cool one, it's creative and all that kind of stuff, but if you avoid what you are kind of anxious about because you don't have much self-esteem, and you withdraw because you don't think you're going to be too effective in what you're doing. The CBT people, and I'm really thinking of Aaron T. Beck, who died just 2 years ago, said early on it was called activity scheduling, and then later it was called behavioral activation by 1979. And then later, because he didn't know anything about neuroscience, later it was demonstrated that doing what you don't feel like doing, meaning approach behavior, kicked on your left hemisphere, and your left hemisphere was more likely to put a positive spin on your experience. And in fact, that all related, if I could just run on a little bit more, another huge body of literature related to people that had their corpus callosum cut in half, and Roger Sperry, who won the Nobel Prize for this, found that people who tended to have more right tended to come up with a lot of reasons why they weren't doing so well. People who were more left did what later was called confabulation. And what do I mean by that? Putting a positive spin on not so good things, which isn't really a bad idea. So how does this all relate to the bottom line of building in motivation and self-esteem? It means doing what you don't feel like doing and faking it until you make it actually has neuroscience support. Meaning that how are you going to feel like you have better self-esteem by sitting there and not doing anything? I mean, frankly, even Freud did more things with his clients than we know about this, because Ernest Jones was his major translator. I was at Freud's place a couple months ago, and I wanted to walk around the neighborhoods that he would walk around with some of his clients. And so we're stuck in this idea that all you got to do is sit there and talk for self-esteem. I think it's important, but it's a reality that you've got to get people to do things to get their brain working better so they can feel better about themselves.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Lillian. Let's go to the next question with more votes, which comes from Helene Lachapelaine and reads, does childhood trauma that has been suppressed or not worked through return in a greater way as people age, especially with more time to think due to retirement and isolation? John, do you want to have a
Sure. Yeah, what I was trying to demonstrate with some of that brain talk early on was later, let's say, for example, you were an abused kid, and neglected, and maybe you suffered child abuse, but you did pretty well during most of your life. And then a series of events later in life resulted in you not being able to respond in the ways that other people do. And let me even refer to a client that I had. So this particular client was the son of a out of control alcoholic that used to beat him up all the time. And in fact, whenever his father would come home, he would go hide underneath the car. His father would see his legs hanging out from underneath the car, and he'd yank him out of there and beat him up. And this guy later managed to get out of the house by late teens and went to college, and he became a really successful guy in the community. And by the time I saw him, he had just experienced a trauma, and the trauma was a different one than I would experience. A gun was pointed at him, and it was only for like 10 seconds. And all of these feelings of being out of control and not being in great shape he wasn't able to contain them. He was older. And so this relates to this idea that the older you are and the less healthy you are, the less able to kind of put a lid on things. And our job was to rebuild a lot of what, it wasn't like he went back to zero and he was this kid that his father pulled out from underneath, but his ability to contain that experience was quite different because he didn't have the infrastructure. However, if I can just add one more thing here, this idea of repressed memories that is part of our sort of folklore and all that, I think we overplayed that card. It's not like you did the zip drive and all of a sudden all these memories and all this repressed terrible trauma came out. It's really about the infrastructure of our ability to create a sense of shock absorbers. Earlier, Lillian, I noticed you used the word allostatic load in your talk. And really, that's where we are with the whole idea of stress. You don't want to have no stress because you're dead. You want to be able to deal with the bumps in the roads and all that kind of stuff. The problem is some people aren't able to have those shock absorbers, and we have to help them deal with stress if you want to put it in that way, by building in some shock absorbers, partly by modeling and acknowledging our own imperfections as part of what we're modeling. Because I love Donald Winnicott's idea of you could just say good enough parenting. Well, we ought to be good enough therapists. We don't want to be perfect therapists. And if there's an opportunity for you to acknowledge your own humanity, it's a gift for our clients, because they look up to you. And if you could acknowledge you kind of blow it here and there, they can feel almost like, oh my God, there's some hope. I'm not this broken person, so to speak, because I could see that even my therapist is a little bit fallible.
Thank you, John. I wonder, Lillian, whether you want to add anything to this. Certainly, stands where most of our clients are referred within the first 5 years after arrival, but we do have a 10 to 15% that are referred much later, and often after having managed quite well with the impact of the trauma.
Yeah, absolutely, Helen. I liked this question because I thought it was quite interesting and relevant to my clients. And I think, yeah, particularly if we think about age-related processes, sometimes, a normal level of sort of degeneration in the brain and perhaps a loss of some capacities, within the prefrontal cortex or, the limbic system, that can, I think, cause, previously sort of perhaps, maybe not suppressed, but unresolved trauma that, the person's been sort of able to cope with for most of their life to suddenly feel more intense. And I think that was one of the sort of interactions in Heng's case. I think also it depends, whether the previous trauma, for this older adult, like it occurred 45 years ago, but he was an adult at the time. I think it's also important to sort of distinguish, the effects of childhood and developmental trauma that occurs when the brain is still developing, and that can have really profound sort of disruptive influences on the development of the prefrontal cortex and on all those, processes of, being able to regulate emotions effectively and, exercise good judgment and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I guess this is just thoughts that came to mind with this question.
Thank you, Lillian. Let's go to the next question. We've got a lot of questions, and for sure we won't have time to answer them all. But the next one is from Boca Likanen, and it reads, "Thank you for the great presentation. My question is related to workers, carers, people who experience vicarious trauma through their working with and or caring for traumatized people. Do they have higher tendency to develop body-brain inflammatory responses and health conditions?" And maybe, John, if you have a go at that one.
And I want to make sure that I heard the question. So if I can repeat it and you tell me whether or not this is what the question was. People that have had repeated traumas that were vicarious, in other words, they saw other people have those experiences, then later did they end up having all sorts of systemic problems like chronic inflammation and other systemic problems? Is that what the question was?
Yes, and I think that Boca was relating it particularly to workers and carers, people like us.
Oh, yes. Right, exactly. that is, and the compassion fatigue and this whole area that we're always talking about. I mean, throughout the mental health system, all over the world. And there's really a very, it's almost like a balance act. Do you have constant emotional empathy and compassion? And compassion is really the active part of empathy, of course. Or is it cognitive empathy? And so we're toggling back and forth. And that toggling back and forth between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy, to me, in terms of my reading of all this compassion fatigue literature, and God, I've been to hundreds and thousands, literally, of staff meetings and leading the staff meetings and all that kind of stuff. And so always we're talking about that. And so that toggle back and forth between cognitive empathy and emotional empathy is really a critical one, because flipping to the cognitive empathy without objectifying the client, in other words, they've got to feel felt. And that's where the emotional empathy part is. I'm putting them in two different categories, but it's so much more complicated than that. So people feeling felt is really part of the healing, and Rogers and other people address that. On the other hand, let's call it the Freud people over here that had the cognitive empathy part. They were analyzing. Okay, and I went to my analyst, so to speak. They're not necessarily bad. One's good and one's bad. And so to some degree, that toggle back and forth and having cognitive empathy and finding the client interesting, and I want to underline this, finding the client interesting allows us to not get sucked down into this abyss. And I remember, for the longest while, feeling like, especially with depressed people, oh my God, it's so depressing, being there with them. But if I found it interesting at the same time of giving them the emotional empathy and being able to toggle back and forth, I wouldn't have as much cognitive empathy. I'm sorry, compassion fatigue.
And John, how does that relate to? Does that relate to a higher tendency to develop body-brain inflammatory responses for us?
Yeah, that's boy. And so now the inflammatory network that is so much larger in the picture than we ever thought before. In fact, I know that Bessel van der Kolk is going to be giving a talk on Saturday and all that. And Bessel and I were talking about this some years ago when we were going to do this Cuba thing together a long time ago. And I was saying, hey, you know what? I think all this literature on chronic inflammation related to trauma is so critically important. And he agreed. In fact, he later labeled his book, The Body Knows the Score, so to speak, which was a cool title. So everything that you experience in a incredibly, let's say, overexcited way can turn on your immune system inappropriately. Let's put it in evolutionary perspective. So remember, we were all hunter-gatherers. We're running around, and there were predators out there constantly. And so whenever we'd see a predator, our immune system would turn on in anticipation of being mauled by the lion. Just having stress turns on the inflammatory network. And so now let's get back to compassion fatigue. Which is kind of the tumbled in question here. In some ways, hearing another person's terrible, God, and you of all, and I have heard some terrible stories that make us vicariously feel terrible, right? And that toggle back and forth to some degree, as long as we've got the seeds elements as well. But here we have education, because in many ways, having cognitive empathy makes the person's presentation interesting. They've got to feel like they are an interesting person rather than just another broken person.
Thank you. Lillian, anything you'd like to add?
No, I do. Yeah, I kind of, I just had the thought that anecdotally I have heard of the tendency of, health workers more than the average population to develop sort of autoimmune diseases and things like this, but I have no references to science. Yeah, just interested.
Yeah. No, thank you, Lillian. And from many talks that I had with you, John, I gather that your suggestion for us as workers is pretty much along the lines of what Lillian was trying to do with her client, and basically put those seeds into practice and make sure we look after the sleep, our diet, and other aspects of our lives. Now, I'm very conscious that we got lots of questions open, 27. And there's no way that we're going to answer 27 questions in the next 5 minutes. But let's see if we can have a go at sharp sort of. We have the next question that comes that reads: I'm mindful of people who have little capacity to improve sleep, such as children with disabilities who are awake at night and shift workers. Is there anything you can suggest to help them make the most of the sleep they do get?
Can I take the rotating shift, shift work here to begin with? Since 1950, that's a long time ago. That's over 70 years ago. We psychologists have demonstrated that rotating shifts are debilitating. And so my suggestion, especially in the healthcare world, and nurses are really the ones that seem to do it a little bit more. But my own son started to work in an organization in San Francisco that I worked at when I was in my 20s, and they had him on this shift work idea. And there is just it just doesn't seem like there's any solution to rotating shifts that's going to make it healthy. It's just dumb, because you're always adjusting. Think of jet lag. For every time zone that you move, it takes roughly about a week to catch up. And some of us have to do it really quickly. Imagine shift work. You're doing it constantly. So I don't think there's any solution. And the problem is the solutions that people have manufactured make the shift work even worse, which is medication. Either the over-the-counter Benadryl-like substances, or the Ambien-like substances, or the garbage of our healthcare system, which is the Benadryl. So this whole field called CBTI, which is cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, is really got to be part of the picture for how to re-regulate the sleep cycle, and also educating the healthcare workers, especially the people that are doing this shift work. I'm sorry for ranting about that, but it's just darn ass dumb to continue doing that, especially in the healthcare system where we're supposedly paying attention to the health research.
Thank you. I might go next to the next most voted question from Cassia Cadillo, and it reads, and maybe the last one we have time for: how to avoid or substitute a sleep aid medication for neurodiverse individuals on stimulant medication, considering they have a balanced diet, active lifestyle, and are active learners. So into that, herbal remedies, lavender, lemon balm, ashwagandha, hops, valerian root, a possible option, or are they as damaging as prescription medication?
Those last, can you complete? I've tried this and that and this and that. What are those?
Sure. Essentially is assuming that people have a balanced diet, active lifestyle, and are active learners, are herbal remedies such as lavender, lemon balm, hops, valerian root a possible option, or are they as damaging as prescription medication?
Oh, you just froze. I hope my internet is working here, but let me pick apart a couple of those. It seems that my reading and actually experiencing the ones that you mentioned, valerian. Let's put valerian on one side, and lemon balm, and passion flower, and peppermint on another side. Valerian root seems to contribute to depression from what I've read and what I've experienced, because sometimes I just try this stuff just to see how it works. And so valerian, if you go to a health food store, you're going to see these sleep medications and more valerian and all that. Heck, I don't want to add to any kind of depressing feelings that I might have and all that. On the other hand, lemon balm and peppermint and some of those other more chamomile tea and those kinds of things. Actually, and by the way, if I could throw in magnesium, there's considerable evidence. Even the last couple of days, I was even reading a couple articles recently that magnesium is actually underconsumed in our diet anyway. And so if you're going to take it in a supplement form, because you might not have as much in your diet, taking it at night is actually quite conducive. And if you can add in a D3, so we also know that vitamin D not only is really good for immune system, and we found that people that don't have as much vitamin D actually get COVID more often. So if you add vitamin D, if you're going to take it at all, if you take it at night and you take it with a CalMag tab, I have seen no evidence to suggest that that's actually bad for your sleep. In fact, I've read and experienced myself. I have CalMag tabs with me here in Sydney, that it's only a benefit. I mean, I'm not prescribing anything, but my reading of the literature is it's a heck of a lot better and even more effective than lemon balm and peppermint tea and chamomile and all that, which I do anyway, right? But the valerian side of things, the sedators, I'm very skeptical of and also cautious about.
Thank you, John. Lillian, anything you'd like to throw into this question?
No, John's covered everything.
All right, it's 5:01, so 1 minute over. However, I need to tell you, after we thank you, of course, it's been an amazing presentation. We'll try and find a way to keep the webinar chat, because you got a lot of fans in there and a lot of compliments about how sensational this clinical masterclass has been to you both. But before I put a final close to this, I'd like to also give you a bit of a couple of ads. If you enjoyed John Arden's talk, please join us on a live seminar that will be happening on the 7th and 8th of March, so Thursday and Friday, and which touch a much wider, have a much wider scope, looking at an integrated approach to trauma treatment, synthesizing neuroscience, attachment theory, and evidence-based modalities. This will take place at the New South Wales Teachers Federation Conference Centre Auditorium. And if you want to attend, please register online. We can find all the details in our website, in STAR's website. And what am I trying to do is record some of the questions. We got like 20 more questions, actually 27 more questions, and some of them are fantastic. So if there's any gap in the Q&A at the seminar, I might keep some of these and throw them at you, John. We also having another masterclass, a clinical masterclass on the 22nd of May this year, and it will be on cultural and psychological implications of sexual assault and rape for refugee women, working with disclosure, shame, stigma, and guilt. The external speaker will be Professor Dr. Lata Satyan, and the STARS presenters will be Pearl Fernandez and Bina O'Sullivan.